Good afternoon. Thank you for joining this webinar by the Society for Range Management. My name is Eric Winford, and I'll get the webinar started in just a few seconds here when we let everyone join in from Zoom land. In the meantime, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and the Society for Range Management that is hosting this webinar. So as I mentioned, my name is Eric Winford. I work for the University of Idaho Rangeland Center. I'm based out of Boise, Idaho, but do work from around the state. And I'm currently on the board of directors for the Idaho section for the Society for Range Management. And the Society for Range Management is a professional society committed to the conservation of rangelands through science-based stewardship. And if you're interested in what you hear today, or are just interested in rangelands or want some more information, please go to our website. I'll post a link in the chat and find out some more. All right. So it looks like participants have stabilized, so I'm going to go ahead and start with an introduction to today's discussion. Today we have a great presentation by Derek Tilley on when is a weed not a weed, strategies for succession management in rangelands. And Derek grew up in Northern California near Sacramento. He went to Brigham Young University Provo for a bachelor's in botany and a master's in plant taxonomy. After graduation, he worked for the National Park Service at Dinosaur National Monument and for the University of Idaho Research and Extension Center in Parma, Idaho. In 2004, Derek began work with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service Plant Materials Center in Aberdeen, Idaho. In 2014, Derek was selected as manager of the Aberdeen Plant Materials Center to direct studies in sage-grouse habitat restoration and the enhancement of agricultural soil health through cover cropping. His research interests include developing plant materials and restoration strategies in the Intermountain West. So with that, Derek, if you want to start your camera and introduce yourself and then start your slides, we'll begin.
Okay, well, thanks, Eric, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak. Hopefully everyone can hear me and see me all right. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Make sure I get this right. Oh, hang on, one more try. Can you guys confirm that that's the right screen?
That is the right screen. That looks good. Thank you.
Super. All right. So like Eric said, we're going to talk about weeds and succession management for rangeland restoration. And I wanted to give just a real quick background on what NRCS is and what we do. So NRCS began back in the 30s as the Soil Erosion Service in response to the Dust Bowl that was happening in Texas and Oklahoma. And our job is to work with private landowners. We're not a land management agency like BLM, but we work with private landowners, ranchers, and farmers to conserve the natural resources on their lands. And right now what we do is offer technical and financial assistance to help the landowners put in conservation practices to depending on what the resource concern is. In 1994, we went from the Soil Conservation Service to the NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service. So that's where we are today. We've got about 11,000 employees, give or take. And I work for what's called the Plant Materials Program. This is sort of the research wing of the NRCS, and different plant materials centers, and you can see we've got 27 on the map there. We work to develop plant solutions for those resource concerns. And it's not really state boundaries. As you can see there, we're kind of scattered across the country based on ecoregion, climate, that kind of thing. So the Aberdeen PMC, where I work, takes up a good chunk of Idaho and Utah, but really the service area that we provide information for is the entire Great Basin or Intermountain region. Right now, we do a lot of our work on range and forest lands. We are doing a lot with sage grouse habitat. We have done a lot with riparian and wetland systems. And we also have kind of a research branch that looks at agricultural systems and building soil health. And what we do, for the most part, is develop plant releases or cultivars or varieties to address the resource concerns. We also produce seed and plants of whatever releases we make. And then we also develop technologies to better install these plants or get them to grow right or get them to address whatever conservation concern there is. And we do technology transfer and try to get our information out to the public as well. And you can see on that map, we've got a fairly, diverse region that we work in, several different ecosystems, several different elevations. So it's quite diverse, like I said. So let's jump into weeds, which is going to be the topic of today. And I want to start with the book Weeds of the West. And I think most people have seen this. A lot of people have multiple copies in their office. If you look at Weeds of the West, it's in the 10th or 11th edition now, maybe even more than that. And it contains about 300 different species that it lists as a weed for one reason or another. And you want to ask the question, what does it actually take to get yourself listed in this book if you're a plant? And so to start with, the authors list the definition of a weed, and I think it's pretty good. It's any plant that interferes with management objectives for a given area of land at a given point of time. And the classic example of this is, a rose bush in a cornfield. And in the picture, we've got, I think, oriental poppy in a wheat field. And so it's a fairly loose definition. You can, there's a lot of management objectives out there. And so weed could be almost anything depending on what the objectives are. But let's just dive into what some of the plants are in Weeds of the West. So here's one that may be pretty surprising. This is sagebrush, probably the most iconic and important plant in the Intermountain region, and it's listed in Weeds of the West. And it's got to be because it interferes with grazing objectives, or at least it did at one point or another. But that's a surprising plant to have in Weeds of the West. Here's some more. These are both milkweed species. You probably know milkweeds are critical to the monarch butterfly life cycle. Monarchs could get listed under the Endangered Species Act really any day now, but these plants are in Weeds of the West, and leads to the perception that they're weeds and need to be controlled or sprayed whenever you see them. Here's another one. This is rubber rabbit brush. Incredibly important plant on the rangeland to provide pollinator nectar and pollen for our native insects out there, especially late in the season. This one's found its way into Weeds of the West. This is an interesting one. This is Verbena bracteata, and I'm scratching my head to figure out what management objective this plant impedes. But really, unless you just want pure bare ground, it's not doing anything. Again, this is another native species. Very adapted to disturb sites. Here's another one. This is Curlycup Gumweed. And because it's in Weeds of the West, it's led a lot of people to think that it's not native and that it's invasive. But it's really valuable, again, for late season pollinator habitat and soil stabilization and other things in the disturbed sites. And so if you look at that table on the top right, out of all the species in Weeds of the West, about 40% of them are native. And that should really be a surprise to some people. And I really think that a lot of these plants, the natives that get listed there, are there because of some kind of grazing management strategies, and they're just not optimum forage for cattle or for livestock. But as a restorationist, it begs the question, what are the implications of the misbranding of these quote unquote native weeds? And I think that they are a tool that we have missed out on and that we aren't using because of this misbranding, because of the misperception. So briefly, I want to talk about disturbance in the Intermountain West and some of the problems we're facing. And I think it all starts with the unnatural grazing timing and intensity that we see in our rangelands. This has led to weakened ecosystems, weakened resilience, and resistance against invasion from things like cheatgrass, ventonata, and medusa head. They're pretty much the top three right now. Add to that the fact that we've planted thousands of acres with perennial forage grasses like crested wheatgrass and Siberian wheatgrass. You start to see the beginnings of these mega fires that we're actually kind of getting used to now, thousands and thousands of acres burning on a much quicker time scale than is natural. And in the NRCS, I deal a lot with agricultural lands. These might be areas that have been grazed or farmed and have been played out, and so they want to restore them back to some kind of natural habitat. Put climate change in there, temperature change and changes in precipitation amounts and timings. And all of these things are affecting the natural cycles and processes both above and below ground. And it's our job to address all of this with some form of restoration. And so here, I want to talk a little bit about how broad that term restoration is and what it means. And it really does depend on who you are, who you work for, and what the objectives and goals are. So NRCS works with private landowners. They're going to have different goals than, say, the National Park Service. Park Service is going to want to restore ecosystems almost, species to species, plant to plant, pre-disturbance to post-disturbance. BLM rules are going to be a little bit different from Fish and Wildlife Service rules. And now we're starting to see these things like the National Seed Strategy, where agencies have come together and they're trying to make some sensible goals about what kind of species we use and what types of restoration we should be attempting. Then there's a new group with the National Academy of Sciences. And, if you look at that picture on the right, it's just meant to show that there's several different ways to address restoration, or you can call it reclamation or rehabilitation, depending on where you jump in that stream between the damaged ecosystem and your target objectives. But overall, we've seen fairly low success rates. Grass seedings we're pretty good at. When you start adding forbs and shrubs, we're not as good. And so we really do want to increase our success rates in these fields. Now, Mother Nature has evolved a strategy to do this already. So we go from the wildfire there in what I'm just going to call the climax community. You can also think of it as the PNC, potential natural community. And after a natural disturbance, the first thing you see is a suite of really small statured diminutive annual forbs, typically in our region. We've got slender phlox and some other things. And those, capture the site from the existing seed bank. They hold the soil, they start to cycle nutrients and transition things. And over a short amount of time, 1 to a couple of years, you see that next stage in succession, which is, a little bit larger statured biennials and short-lived perennials there. And then over more time, that transitions to what we're used to in the sagebrush steppe. And that could go further if time allows. You could start seeing juniper encroachment and end up with a woodland. But usually it's these 4 steps in general. And these are very broad, very generalized steps. There's a lot more to it than this, but this is the natural restoration. Now, what we do, or what we attempt to do, is a little bit different. So again, there at the top is the natural community succession. We're just going to call that early, mid, and late or climax plant communities, early cereal, mid cereal. More often than not, once we've got a disturbance, what we see is an infestation of weeds, and that just perpetuates itself for a long time, and there will be recurrent fires and weeds will just persist. So what we do, and hopefully my mouse is working, we try to treat that disturbance with some kind of restoration, and if we're lucky, what we're doing is skipping the early and middle successional phases, and we almost always try to jump straight to that climax plant community. And like I said, our success rates are pretty poor. So more, quite often we hit failure, which leads us back to more disturbance. And we either continue to treat whenever funding's available, or it just cycles back into this weed community. So there's a lot of things going on when it comes to plant succession that I think we really need to look at and better understand what nature has developed and why we're missing out. So this is just an example. This is nitrate levels in the soil. And if you look at, let's see, on the y-axis, you've got mineralized nitrates or nitrogen. And on the x-axis, I've got time since disturbance. So here's the stable climax community. Then there's some kind of disturbance right here. And then we transition through the early, middle, and late cereal plant communities. So at the time of disturbance, let's say it's a wildfire, the mineralized N shoots up in its levels due to the plant die-off and the roots breaking down. And so that peaks, and these different plant successional communities drive those nitrate levels back down over time, back to the stable community or stable conditions where the climax community is adapted. And so you've got to ask yourself, okay, what are the results if we're trying to plant the climax community in these high nitrate areas? Another thing to keep in mind is in a cheatgrass cycle, due to their biomass production and then yearly die-off, the nitrate levels in those communities are stable way up here, which is another reason why we're having low success in establishing the climax community after a cheatgrass. Another idea we want to keep in mind is diversity. And I think as restorationists, we're getting pretty good at understanding spatial diversity. The idea that the more different types of plants we have in on the landscape, the more morphological diversity, the more resilient the site is against invasion. The more niches are filled, we've got better competition, we've got things happening above and below ground to keep invasion from happening. And so this picture from, let's see, the Sage Grouse Initiative shows a few different perennial grasses, a couple different perennial forbs, and sagebrush. And the research has shown that if you have a good diverse community, that you're less likely to get invaded by cheatgrass and other things. One thing I think we're missing is the idea of temporal diversity. So yeah, looking at Doc Brown there. So in this graph, we've got, again, time since disturbance on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, it's just some measure of abundance and resilience based on these three different communities. The early cereal, mid cereal, and late cereal or climax community. So when we go into a disturbance and plant the traditional late cereal climax mix, we've got this lag time of low resilience as those plants get established on the landscape and start to become more and more competitive. And so if we're only planting a late cereal mix, we're really opening ourselves up to invasion. And this is where almost always our plant restoration projects fail. But if we add the early and middle cereal groups, then we've got this temporal diversity and resilience at all of the time scales throughout the successional process. And we're starting to develop a good sense of early cereal species reducing invasive species. So in most cases, these are greenhouse or laboratory studies where you'll plant a cheatgrass next to a cheatgrass in a pot, and then you'll plant a cheatgrass next to a native something or other in a pot. And the research is showing that the natives are suppressing cheatgrass growth and seed production. So here we see in one study, fiddleneck reduced cheatgrass biomass. In another study, Western tansy mustard reduced cheatgrass seed production by 79%. Another study showed that annual ragweed and common sunflower reduced the biomass of cheatgrass, whitetop, and Canada thistle. And then in a small plot study, we're starting to see the early cereal species reduce weed cover. So we're developing the literature and the scientific knowledge here that really does support the idea that early successional, early cereal species are very competitive against our invaders. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they act behaviorally and their phenology is very similar to most of our invasives. So a lot of these early cereal species germinate in the cold the same time cheatgrass does, and they put on growth much quicker than the climax community species. So what role does succession play in our restoration planning and application? And the answer is really it doesn't. So this shot here is from the NRCS ecological site description of a loamy soil and a 12 to 16 inch precip site. This is a mountain big sagebrush, Idaho fescue, blue bunch wheatgrass site. And the ESDs is really where we go to get our information on how to develop a seed mix for a restoration plan, especially, you know, most of the restoration sites aren't familiar to us to begin with. You know, we get a call from outside and get asked to develop a seed mix to a site we've never been on. So this is our first step. And when you go to the ESDs, you're going to find these groupings in tables, the grasses, forbs, and shrubs, and they show percent composition and pounds of biomass in low productive sites or high productive sites in this ecosystem. And if you look through all the species codes, you get a decent idea of what can be there in the climax community, but it doesn't do anything to separate the different successional phases. Another place we'll go to develop our mixes is the NRCS state and transition models. And these show what can happen and what states a plant community can go to following different management strategies. And again, these don't list succession in any significant way. There's a couple boxes circled there where they mention annuals. And that's really as close as it gets to any kind of succession discussion. So now we'll just briefly discuss what I'm proposing to do as far as restoration approaches. So if you look on the left, I've got the boxes of the traditional approaches, and I kind of generalize these into three groups. And these are kind of increasing as far as cost per acre as you go up the page, and also similarity to the site climax community as you go up. So starting with the restoration approach number one, this is kind of the Park Service, you know, Supreme Cadillac method. This is to match pre-disturbance species with local ecotypes. And I've got some notes here. So one of the problems is seed is likely not available for local ecotypes on the scale that we do restoration. So usually we have to contract, collect that seed, and then do a year or two of seed production grow outs. And this gets very, very costly. Restoration strategy number two is to approximate the pre-disturbance species with mostly non-local but adapted germplasms and cultivars. And this is what we typically do now. You know, we might have a restoration site in Utah, but the best, you know, blue bunch wheatgrass cultivar out there originated from southeastern Washington. But it's best adapted and shows the best performance, and it's cheap enough to use. Again, this is the most common restoration form out there. There's questionable resilience of this approach just based on genetic differences and long-term issues with different cultivars coming from so far away. And this is where we've had our mixed results with success. And if you go way down the bottom, there's what I've got as the reclamation mix. And this is basically the crested wheatgrass approach, just throwing introduced perennial grasses on the landscape to capture the site, maybe prevent erosion, maybe provide some forage, but really limited ecological function. So the new proposal is to do what I'm calling a mixed cereal restoration mix. And this includes representation from all of the morphological diversity of the plant species available, so grasses, forbs, and shrubs. But I also want to represent all of the different successional stages within that. So it's quite a diverse mix. I also see potential for just a mix of early cereal species alone. This would be very limited to, say, post-wildfire sites on a hillside where you're worried about erosion happening and washing soil and stuff down into a river down below. And I think maybe if we apply a good suite of colonizers, these early successional species there, if there's a known existing seed bank of other things there, this could help bridge the gap. Some other things to think about that we have to look at here. The first thing I want to look at is seeding rates. NRCS Idaho recommends about 250 to 500 seeds per square meter if you're using a drill planter. We double that typically for broadcast seeding just because of the limited seed to soil contact. So at a maximum, we're putting 1,000 seeds down per square meter. But we know from the literature that cheatgrass, for example, can be in an excess of 30,000 seeds per square meter in the seed bank. So is it a fair fight, really? And just in the picture, you see 500 sunflowers seeds and 10,000 sunflower seeds, and triple that big pile for accurate representation of cheatgrass. And so it really feels like we're going into this fight with our hands tied behind our backs. So how do we arrive at those current seeding rates? If you go back into the literature, most of this was done back in the 60s and 70s. They were looking at studies to see what the most cost-effective rate was to get crested wheatgrass to grow in the rangelands. And so you'd see studies like this where they've got 24 pounds per acre, 12 pounds per acre, 8 and 4 and 2 pounds per acre, and they would track plant density over time. And we see a graph like this repeatedly where at the higher seeding rates, you get a higher plant density initially, but then after just 2 or 3 years, everything evens out. And so obviously in their mind, why would you want to put more seed on the ground than is necessary? It's just a waste of money. But a couple things to keep in mind, they were not looking at site resilience as far as invasion, and none of these studies were done in the presence of cheatgrass. In fact, in some of the studies, they would list the weeds that they were dealing with, and in a few cases at least, those weeds were natives. So little different thought process. So again, do weeds have an unfair advantage? Maybe they do, especially in these first year or two. Maybe these high plant densities are beneficial and not a waste of money. And so we ask the question, would adding more seed even the playing field, or would it simply increase competition for already limited resources? And most of these studies, as you can see in the graph, the higher seed rates didn't end up over competing with one another and ending up in reduced stands. It all just evened out. Another thing to think about is what's going on underground. What's happening with the soil health and the soil biology? And so we're asking, does adding soil biology from pristine sites benefit the native species? So can we get soil and whatever microbial and little critters are going on in there and coat the seed or apply that to a range planting and and get benefits that help these help our establishment. And so there's something called a Johnson pile, Sue Johnson bioreactor, and it's basically a composter, and you can develop soil probiotics on a scale here, and it gets applied at a very small rate. So that Johnson pile there is enough to, treat many acres worth of seed. It develops beneficial fungi and bacteria. It's a non-stir method, so it's not breaking up the fungal component. You can get mycelial growth in here. But also it's not propagating AMF because you need live plants for that. So we're looking into this, and a lot of other researchers are looking into what's going on underground. And like I mentioned at the beginning, the plant materials program is mostly about plant release development. So that's where we'll go here. And that always follows this pattern. So seed collection of native populations. And we look at as many populations as we can find in our service area or area of interest. We'll bring the seed back, plant them in common garden studies, or do some kind of comparative analyses on them. And once we have chosen an accession or a population to represent a new release, then we produce what's called foundation seed, and that goes out to the commercial market for production, and then that seed ends up used for restoration. There we go. So I think one thing we can do in this scenario with the early successional species is to kind of develop a filter to choose species to do research on. So if you look at the whole range of adaptation, let's say the Great Basin, we can scour through, Intermountain flora and Utah flora and make a list of somewhat of the early successional species, although that information is limited. Then we can look at different seed production attributes of the different plants, because you can't use, like the slender phlox is way too small for any kind of seed production. So a lot of those get eliminated from the runnings immediately. And then if we look for different traits, like I said, cold germination traits to go head to head with cheatgrass in the fall and in early spring. And we can kind of, start with a big list of species and then narrow it down quite effectively. And there really, surprisingly, isn't any good listing of species by successional stages, especially at least in the Intermountain West. You can get some information from the regional floras, but it's really not easy to find. But I think one thing we can do is to just go around on our different highways and roadsides, and we see the same plant community over and over in this, almost permanent disturbance area from between the road and the native plant community. And everywhere we go, we see almost the same community. It's got either cheatgrass or ventonata or medusa head, depending on where you are and what stage of the invasion you're in. And then you've got this list of natives: gumweed, rabbit brush, that verbena. We see sand dropseed in a lot of sites. We often see common sunflower. Down in Utah, in the pinyon juniper range, we'll see multi-lobe groundsel. We see fiddleneck, especially to the west. And down in the southern kind of warm season deserts, we start seeing purple 3-on. And so this, I think, is a good place for us to start looking for early successional species that we can develop. And so the first one we took on was Curlycup Gumweed. And this little plant has got some great attributes that get overlooked. And again, right back to the beginning, it's because it's listed in Weeds of the West. Most people think it's an introduced species. A lot of people think it's invasive because we see it on overgrazed rangeland, though I would contend that that's a result of poor grazing management and not the plant's fault. So if we look at the attributes here, it's a short-lived perennial. Fits that early to mid-cereal stage, very well adapted to disturbed sites, very easy to establish. It's a late season bloomer, so it's really good for our pollinators where we don't have a lot of species on offer during the late summer and early fall. Produces a lot of seed that gets shattered in the winter, and so small birds pick the seed up off the snow. And it's got good production attributes. So it's upright in stature, produces lots of seed, pretty easy to work with. Just a brief note on the pollinators. It's really a tremendous pollinator plant. We've got records of over 40 genera of native and introduced bees on it. Just some shots there. It's been found in the crops of sage grouse, especially in the young chicks. So good sage grouse species, both in terms of bringing in insects for the little chicks to eat and the foliage for them to eat. And so we've been working on developing a release of gumweed for the last few years. We've got about 25 different plant collections from the Intermountain West, and we wanted to cover as many ecoregions as possible in our analysis. You can see the spots there and the ecoregions they belong to. And, you know, it would be great if we could develop a plant release for each one of those ecoregions, but I don't think the seed market would support that, just because it gets much more expensive the smaller your area of adaptation is. And so what we want to do is make a release that captures the broadest genetic range of all these species. And so as we're evaluating them, we're also doing genetic work, and we might put multiple populations into the final release if we find that there's metapopulations out there. And so we bring all these seeds back to the Plant Materials Center, and we did a common garden study. You can see in that picture that we have plants put into weed barrier fabric into different replicated plots. And we measured traits like plant height, percentage of plants that flowered in the first year. Remember, gumweed's a biennial, so typically doesn't flower in the first year, but that would have been a real benefit to seed producers. So we measured that. We measured survival over the winter into the second year, flower production, and tie that to seed production. We also evaluated lodging, which is a seed production attribute that we want to avoid if possible. And then flowering duration. How long are the flowers offering pollen and nectar to the insects? We also did some lab work. We looked at seed mass. We looked at how much the roots had grown after 10 days after planting. The idea being that a seed that establishes a root quicker is more likely to establish in our drought cycles. And then we did some production and planting trials looking at different seeding depths and different harvest methods. So just for example, this is our 10-day root evaluation. We actually do this in oxygenated water baths, and this helps, it allows us to skip over the seed dormancy mechanisms that gumweed has. So typically you would have to stratify gumweed in cold, moist sand for 60 to 90 days to get any germination out of it. But if you put the seed in these oxygenated water baths, they start to germinate within 24 hours. And so we standardize the germination, everything starts to germinate almost immediately. And then after 10 days, we pull the little seedlings out, put them on a scanner, digitize them, and measure the root growth. Here's some shots from our seed harvesting trials. We've got the flail vac harvester on the left. Bottom right is me using a beater and a hopper. So it's a racquetball racket and a canvas collecting hoop. And on the top, I'm using a hedge trimmer to simulate a swathing operation. And so this information, you know, helps our seed producers know exactly what they need to do to produce this effectively and efficiently. And so the stage we're in now with the succession management is we're finally getting to larger scaled field trials. And we just planted some of these this last fall. So I've got in my study 3 different sites: Aberdeen, Coffee Point, which is about 25 miles into the desert, the Curlew National Grassland, which is south of here on the Idaho-Utah border. We've got early, late, and combined cereal seed mixes. I'm looking at the standard NRCS rate and a 5x rate and a 10x rate. And then we're doing a split plot with the soil probiotics versus control. So here's our 3 test sites, trying to capture different plant communities. Most of it's in sagebrush community, but the curlew site is a little bit higher elevation. So we've got a decent range of diversity in our sites. Also, as far as weed pressure goes. And here's the mixes. I thought we'd spend just a minute on these. So on the top, we've got the standard late cereal mix, and it's a pretty good mix diversity-wise. So we've got 3 different forbs. That's yarrow, globe mallow, and flax. 3 grasses, blue bunch wheatgrass, sandbird bluegrass, and thick spike wheatgrass, and then the late cereal big sagebrush. And I just put these in at even rates, 14% of the mix, and you can see the NRCS seed rates over here. And so the applied rate is about 3.5 pounds per acre, or 31 pure live seeds per foot from that mix. The early cereal mix has, as far as forbs go, gumweed, tansy aster, fiddleneck, and sunflower. The grasses are bottlebrush squirreltail, sand dropseed, and purple 3-on, and it's got rubber rabbit brush for the sage or the shrub component. And then the combined mix is just everything together. And so if you look at the applied PLS per foot, like I said, this one's 31, this is about 32, this one's about 34. So they're pretty well standardized. And then again, we've got the 5x rate and the 10x rate of all of these. And so where are we now? We've still got a few questions that need to be answered. So will the early cereal natives migrate outside of the restoration site and degrade communities where they're not wanted? And this is a concern that gets brought up a lot. And I think we can pretty easily just say no right off the bat. All of these early cereal species are evolved for establishing and growing in disturbed sites. And so if the outside of the restoration area is not disturbed, then these really don't stand much of a chance of invading. Number 2, will the addition of early cereal native species facilitate a transition to the desired plant community, or will they hinder successional processes and the ultimate climax species composition? This one is still a legitimate question. It is possible that if you put too many highly competitive early cereal natives in a seed mix, that they would slow down or prevent the late cereal species from getting established, and you might end up in some kind of weird successional cycle or where it just sits in an early cereal stage. So what we have to do is really lengthen the duration of our study. So instead of the 2 to 4 year studies, we've got to look at much longer evaluation scales than that, but we're working on it. So real quick, the take-home message is don't confuse ruderal or early cereal with invasive. And I think it would be very valuable if people really start going through Weeds of the West and seeing which of those 40% are native species. I think it'd be surprising. We think we need to incorporate succession management in our restoration plans and mixes. As a plant materials program, we need to increase the availability of both species and quantities of early cereal natives. And I've mentioned demand creates supply. So I think that our restorationists need to start asking seed companies now for these different early cereal species. And once the companies see that there's a demand for them, they will start to produce them and sell them. Because right now availability is really low. Like I mentioned, we need field scale trials to test the species, different blends and different ratios, and we need long-term evaluations to observe succession. And so hopefully, if I've done my job, maybe we can see a change in perspective here, where at one point we would drive past this and say, oh, it's just a bunch of crummy weeds. But I see this now as some really valuable natives holding a site and providing ecological function where really nothing else is. And just for your information, we've developed a couple documents to support this or to help landowners with it. So Tech Note 79 there on the left is basically this lecture in print form. But that seemed a little too much for handing out to a landowner. So we also developed the fact sheet or brochure on the right. It's just a 2-pager. So those are available at the Idaho Plant Materials Center website. And that's it. I am done. That's me. That's my contact information. And I'd be happy to take any questions. I think I ended up in a good amount of time.
Derek, yeah, thank you so much. That's a fascinating talk and a great perspective to share and help us think about the different species that we're seeing out there. We do have a handful of questions I'll go through, but if you have any questions, please do in the chat or the questions box. So let me see here. A couple of questions about disturbance, and I'm going to try to combine them here. Back in the beginning, you talked about disturbance, and we're kind of wondering if the type of disturbance matters. In particular, you mentioned grazing and an unnatural grazing timing, and wondering if you could expand on what that is.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the problems we see today with the weed invasion really stems from 50 to 70 years of really heavy grazing, especially spring grazing, where there's a lot of good evidence now that shows if you graze later in the fall as opposed to spring, it helps support the native plant community and reduce the invasive plant community. And it's a pretty general discussion on disturbance there for sure. And there's really just a broad spectrum of disturbance out there. But I do think that the idea of using succession management is fairly universal. I don't see where it would be harmful in a restoration mix unless it's, some kind of too costly or something like that. But to me, adding successional stages and plants to your seed mix not only helps you establish the plant community now and transition from disturbance to whatever the desired community is, but it's also banking all these different successional stages in the soil and providing resilience against the next disturbance. So if you have a fire 20 years from now, you've got the seed bank intact.
Okay, thank you. And maybe continuing with the early cereal and what they're able to do, a question on, are they able to capture soil nitrogen similar to cheatgrass better than the late cereal species?
Yeah, great question. And I don't know the answer to that yet, but my assumption is yes, because if you look at what's happening with the nitrogen, I think if we have the right early successional species that are putting on a lot of biomass, they're kind of taking up that nitrogen and driving the nitrate levels down. It's a good question, and I'm not a soil scientist, but that's my assumption.
We could say that that's an active area of what you're looking at.
Yeah, and not just me. There's several, well, I wouldn't say several. There's a few good labs out there working on this. I'm just kind of getting started with it. Colorado State University's been doing it for a while. University of Nevada, Reno, Beth Ledger's lab she opened my eyes to this idea a few years ago. So it's not just me, thank goodness. There are other operations working on this.
Okay, a question from a colleague in Canada saying that conservation organizations are hesitant to use cultivars in restoration because of a fear of low genetic diversity. And have you done any work with maintaining or measuring diversity in your released materials, and I guess over time too?
Yeah, great question. And absolutely right. There's kind of a reluctance, especially in a higher, a better site to use these broader cultivars that are, usually just one genotype. The plant materials program is starting to look at genetics. We're doing a genetic analysis and trying to capture as much diversity now, as opposed to in the past, we would make a release just based on one population, whatever we thought was superior. Usually that meant making more forage. But now we're actually looking at that, trying to, either put multiple populations into a blend or, if possible, make multiple releases and then the user can blend the different releases. It's definitely good for discussion, although I think in the broad scheme of things, with the problems we're seeing in the Great Basin, where we've got huge amounts of invasion and huge wildfires, I actually kind of am less concerned with genetic diversity and more concerned with getting something established and stopping the invasion and stopping the wildfires. Now, if you're with the Park Service, I totally get that concern.
Excellent, thank you. And a question on, have you seen this this approach being used elsewhere? Is there examples elsewhere in the world or other ecosystems of kind of focusing on successional restoration or several species restoration?
There's the good question. There's literature out there where people have proposed it. I've seen it in mine reclamation studies in Europe. There's some things happening in Australia, but it really hasn't caught on like you would think. And I don't know what the reason for that is. Maybe people are getting lucky and establishing late zero communities all right, and so they don't have to make this step. But it's not out there as much as you would hope.
And a question on the ecosystem site descriptions, or the ESDs. Do you see this as if fully built out, that there would be a seed mix for each site description out there, or is there thinking that more broad scale?
Yeah, I would love to see NRCS, management at the higher levels make adjustments to the ESDs and the state and transition models. I think if we can show that this is valuable, I think that would at least generate the discussion that might need to happen.
Okay, great. And the question about the soil health, and you mentioned AMF, and just wanted to check that the acronym is correct. Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi.
Correct.
And maybe you could describe like that process a little bit more of how you hope that the probiotics will assist.
Yeah, so man, what's happening underground is really a wide open field. And if there's students out there trying to decide on a career path, I think we really need more work in that area. We make assumptions on what's happening underground, but almost always, we're measuring success by biomass on the surface and now diversity on the surface, which is good, but underground is maybe way more important in the long run. And so there are, every different plant and every different root type has its own, microbial fauna that lives around it. And so the plants are actively exuding sugars and other food for these things to live. And the more things that are alive and cycling underground, the healthier a site is. And so it's just wide open as to what role this plays in succession. Right now, it's just really an assumption that it is important, but we don't have great information yet. And on the agricultural side, we're starting to see this with the use of cover crops, where people will plant, a 10 to 20 species mix in what would normally be a fallow period. And that builds the soil health, it builds soil structure, increases water infiltration, and does all sorts of beneficial things. So it's got to be the same in a native ecosystem.
That's really cool, and that's really good things to consider, especially as we look into the face of what might be another drought year. How we might consider seed mixes for some of those things to improve soil health.
Yeah, and so I think we've really missed out with, you know, our solid monocultures of crested wheatgrass. Yes, they're capturing the soil and preventing some erosion, but I think underground it's just as big a desert as it would be with cheatgrass.
Fascinating. Well, I think that's all the questions that we've had discussed today, and we're almost out of time. So, Derek, I want to thank you very much for taking the time and presenting to us today. And I want to thank everybody for joining in and listening in and providing some great questions. Let me see, one more question. Would it be beneficial to reseed a crested site? Maybe.
Yeah, I've got just a short amount of time to go, but there's been some thought that crested wheatgrass could be a bridge between, you know, a cheatgrass invasion. You put in crested after that, hold the site for a while, and then transition to natives. That's a different kind of approach called assisted succession. And the problem that we're seeing with that approach is it's just really hard to get the crested under control. So if you can, then I think then you can apply these early successional or multi-successional mixes afterwards.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And thanks for providing the information on the links on the tech notes and everything. And everyone, remember, if you're interested in the Society for Range Management and what we heard today, please check us out. We'll have ongoing conversations throughout the year and probably a field trip this summer to check out some sites, and love to have more participation. So that, yeah, thanks a lot, Derek. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate the invite. We'll talk to you later.
Okay, take care.
Bye.